Hi folks, can everyone hear me all right? Yeah? Excellent. So today I will be talking about the 503 days I was working full-time on open source. And that's essentially it. I'll be telling you a little bit of the things I learned, and hopefully not too many people will disagree with me, otherwise we will spend the whole PyCon arguing about our opinions. But I'll just share a couple of things I felt during this time. So my name is... This was a weird introduction. I mean, people are free to disagree with me, right? I'm just... yeah. Never mind the introduction. My name is Rodrigo. I write a lot about Python on Twitter at that handle, and that's going to become relevant pretty soon. And I was working on Textual, which is a Python framework. This is the thing I was working on for 503 days, just for a little bit of context. And for those of you who don't know, it's a framework that lets you write applications like those that actually run inside the terminal. So those are screenshots of terminals. Alrighty, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the lessons I learned, and let's see if they're helpful to you. And I will be dividing the things that I want to talk about into 4 broad topics, into 4 broad categories of things. Those related to getting a tech job in this day and age, those related to managing your ego, those related to interacting with users, and finally those related with working on a big codebase, for a subjective definition of big, obviously. And by the way, pretty important disclaimer, I think this goes without saying, but these are the lessons I learned while I was working on this specific project, so mileage may vary depending on everyone and depending on the project they're working on and their background, everything, right? So this is a subjective talk. Hopefully it's useful, but people will disagree with me on certain things, and that's fine, and it's healthy. So, full 360 on the introduction. Yeah, so let's talk about getting a tech job. And the main point I want to share here is that everything you do online acts as a banner for yourself. So let that sink in. And you can send your CV to companies, you can apply to companies through LinkedIn, but in my short experience, I've never gotten, I mean, I've done interviews like that, I've gotten offers through those processes, but all of the jobs I had were always through random, inexplicable ways. And one of the jobs I got, this one in particular, was through Twitter. So I was active on Twitter, posting about Python. Will, which is the creator of Textual, was there on Twitter as well. We interacted a couple of times. We did this through a timeline of maybe a year, maybe more, and one day he just sent me a message asking, hey, do you want to maybe apply for a position we have? And I applied, and I was able to trick Will into hiring me. And then 503 days later, he found out I think I was doing a pretty decent job, but yeah, things, sometimes they don't work out. Now, that's essentially it. Remember that things you do online, they can work against you, but they can also work in favor. So if you share your work online, if you write online, if you do, I don't know, videos, if they're educational, that might help you get the next job. Now let's talk about managing ego. And this is very personal. I have a pretty sizable ego, and I try to keep it in check. And sometimes things hurt my ego, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to be hurt by the things that I will be talking about. And like Tom, I'm not sure if you were here yesterday for Tom's keynote at the end of the day. It's not about getting rid of your ego, it's just about managing it and making sure it's not in the way of getting things done properly. So, and this whole section is going to be about a very interesting thing, which I haven't found in many other areas. Because in programming, it's not just about getting the job done, as in, it's not only about implementing the feature or fixing the bug, it's also about how you implement the feature, how you fix the bug. So the code you write, the code itself is important. And coming into this job, I realized I was going to be, for the first time in my life, I was going to be the worst Python developer in the room. Because in previous jobs, I was the only Python developer in the room, so by definition, I was the best one. And I was going to be the worst one, probably. And I felt like that was an excellent learning opportunity. And I figured, okay, Rodrigo, it's time to recognize that there's awesome people out there that have lots of things to teach you, right? And with that mindset in mind, I pretty soon realized that code reviews were going to be a very interesting thing. And code reviews go both ways, right? People review my code and I review their code. And I realized that when I was reviewing the code of my colleagues, it was a very good opportunity to ask all of the questions that I have. Even if they sounded basic in my head, I figured that by asking those questions, I would be able to get more knowledge from them, because if I see something and I'm like, why was this done this way? You know, I just ask the question and then they reply, and I learn. So it's net positive for me. And sometimes, when I thought the question was very basic, I asked it the same, and sometimes they had just forgotten some other simpler approach. So it was also net positive for them. So ask all of the questions, even if they might sound basic, it's worth asking them. So that's one thing that I think is very important. And when my code was being reviewed, I figured, okay, I just have to embrace this feedback. My code is going to be scrutinized. More often than not, I will have that red request changes, and I just have to deal with it, because if my peers are reviewing my code and they think something should be changed, then they're probably right. And if I think they're not right, then I'll just ask the question, why do you think I should do it that way? And so maybe the first time it hurt a bit, or it stings a bit, and this was one of the first times I got changes requested in this project. And things got worse. So from one request, now I have a few requests on my PRs. And you know, with experience you go there, you just get more request changes, and then one day you think, okay, I got it, but I didn't. And it just keeps on going. You know, the more PRs you make, the more requests get changed. Or the more, what did I just say? The more changes get requested. I think I switched the words around, I'm not sure. Yeah, but this is not all of my work. So sometimes I make PRs that get accepted on the first try. It's mostly typos and small fixes. And it's also not just about my work, right? It's also about their work. And there were times where I had to request changes, and it's fine, but I don't want to try to look like I'm embarrassing anyone, so I'm just showing some of my work. And this is part of life. I mean, has anyone never gotten any request changes? Does anyone here do frequent open source work and never gotten any request changes? Let the record show that no one raised the hands. So yeah, it's not just about me, right? Hopefully this is common, but if you're going into open source, just keep this in mind. It will happen and it's fine. Now, changes that are requested might be just because I chose a suboptimal path, but sometimes I just make mistakes, and everyone makes mistakes, and it's about understanding that. And you might be upset when you feel like, and this happened to me, something like this. I implemented a feature, we shipped it, and a couple of days later, some bug reports cropped up, and they were about the feature I had implemented, and the bug wasn't about like a weird edge case. It was just a blunder I had made, so something obvious, or in hindsight it was very obvious, that I had missed. And when that happened, I was a bit upset because I felt responsible, right? If I wrote the code, I felt responsible. And my team, thankfully, they said, this is kind of a quote, they said, we don't play the blame game. As in, it's like, it's not your fault, it's our fault in a way, in a kind of a helpful way. And I mean, I still felt like it was my fault, but it's important to realize that if you're helpful and if you're kind when someone makes a mistake, it's more likely that they will be helpful and kind when you make a mistake, and you will eventually, just give it enough time, and you will make a mistake. And just for a little bit of more comic relief, self-deprecating humor, this is the worst issue I ever opened in my entire life. I'm hiding the context because I don't want you to read it. But essentially, if you boil it down, my bug report was something like, yeah, Python runs when you run Python. I was essentially complaining about that, and my colleague just said, yeah, Rodrigo, if you run Python, Python's gonna run. Like, why are you surprised? And then I closed the issue, and thankfully I was working from home, so I didn't have to hide from anyone because I was already hiding. So that was interesting. But it happens to everyone, and I've seen my colleagues also do a couple of different blunders, and if you're helpful and if you're kind, then they're going to pay in the same way. Now, let's move on to interacting with users. Now, this was very I knew that in principle this would be time-consuming and somewhat of a challenge. In practice, it was much harder than I had anticipated. It was also interesting and rewarding, but it's a good challenge. And I was looking at I never know this word in English, I was looking at my notes, like the cheat notes I have here, so I don't forget anything. And for some reason I have the notes of the wrong slide, so we'll just see what happens next. Now, the biggest thing that, like the main takeaway from this section, my biggest suggestion would be create a contributing guide. And no one will read it, but it's still helpful. And I will get back to this guide in a bunch of different times. And for me, again, personal, subjective. For me, for myself, even the way I'm wired and the way I interact with people, this was a lifesaver, and we will see why. So the next best thing you can do is give clear instructions to bug reporters. Again, yesterday, Tom's keynote, Tom said that if you're going to open an issue on a project that you're using for free because someone gives you their time and works on that project, the least you can do is try to create an MRE, right? A minimum reproducible example. And it's the least you can do. I agree with that stance. Hopefully most of us agree with it, but not everyone thinks that way, or maybe inexperienced people will not be familiar with that concept. So just create a bug report template. If you use GitHub, you can go to GitHub and you can add a template for bug reports. And so when users click new issue, then they get something like this. You can click bug reports open or something. What's there? Get started. Yeah, get started with the bug report, and then it fills up the form with a couple of useful instructions. So do that if you haven't already. And so give clear instructions to bug reporters, right? And one thing you can do here, just refer to the contributing guide. Okay, so if you already have the contributing guide, just point to it and say, make sure you go through all of the bullet points that we mentioned. Give the reproducible example. Tell us the Python version you're running, whatever matters to you. Now, another thing that I think is interesting is, not interesting, but something that I tried to be was, I tried to be so kind that it's annoying. As in the sense that I want to be kind, period. People might get on my nerves, but I'll try to not let that show when I reply or when I interact with users, because users are the greatest blessing of a project, right? So if they're there, it's good. This was clearly a rehearsed joke. If they're there, it's good because you don't want to spend your time working on something that no one uses. I think most of us are probably wired that way. So users are going to show up, they're going to interact with you. And sometimes when someone writes something that feels rude or that feels like they have the wrong attitude towards the project or towards the maintainers, something I try to do is, in my head, invent reasons, invent logical explanations for why they're acting apparently in that way. So if it looks like they're being rude, writing in a rude way, maybe, I think in my head, maybe English is not their native language, maybe they're not very fluent with it and it just comes off like that. Maybe they were being rude, but it doesn't matter. You want to stay positive, right? And to give you an anecdotal example, one day I was interacting with a user. They were very helpful. We already knew that person or that user in our project. And I closed one of their PRs, and because English is not my first language, essentially what I said was, you should be ashamed of your work. When that's definitely not what I meant. And then one of my coworkers said, Rodrigo, maybe that's not the word you wanted. And then I translated it, and yeah, it's definitely not the word I wanted. You shouldn't be ashamed of the PR, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. So, again, try to come up with reasonable explanations for those behaviors and try to stay positive. And if you need to, just step out for a bit, it's fine. Now another thing, this is possibly difficult depending on the size of your project, right? But I think that as a courtesy, you should try to give a first reply to a user quickly. If they're opening an issue, if they're opening a pull request, try to be quick in giving a first reply. And a first reply doesn't need to be very long, it's not a review on the pull request. If it's a pull request, maybe say something like, thanks for your time, I'll get back to this when I can. Or if it's a bug report, maybe quickly skim through the bug report and figure out, oh, this person forgot the MRE, so just refer to the contributing guide and say, please add an MRE, it's something like this, or add these commands, or whatever. So I think it's, again, as a courtesy, I think it's important, because when I open an issue on another project, I don't want to wait months for the reply, even though I know people are busy, people have things to do. But maybe it's a vicious cycle. Because I want to give quick replies, I also want them, or because I expect quick replies, I also try to give them. I don't know, but it's a cycle, right? And I don't know, you can automate this, you're programmers, so create an action that just says, thanks for your time, make sure you follow such and such steps, I'll get back to this as soon as possible. It's better than nothing, trust me. Makes sense? Kind of, yeah, okay. Also, another point in favor of giving a first quick reply, if my speaking to this courtesy thing doesn't appeal to you, maybe think of this as a transactional thing. If people are spending time filing bug reports, or if they're spending time making pull requests, then you probably have something to gain with this interaction. So making sure you're responsive will increase the likelihood of getting a good outcome of this interaction. So you can also go transactional if you prefer. And now the most interesting challenge for me was handling external pull requests. And this has to do with the way I interact with people, the way I'm not very confrontational in general, so these situations tested some of my limits. It's going to be different for you, but this was how I decided to tackle the challenge. So imagine this, and this kind of happened. Well, it happens a lot in all of the projects. Someone just opens a pull request out of the blue, because they want to be helpful, probably. No, seriously, right? The people do this out of their own goodwill. They open a pull request because there's a feature they would like implemented, and instead of, I don't know, bothering you, they just do it, and they open the pull request. But sometimes these features are not trivial. You need to discuss the design, you need to make sure it makes sense. Maybe it's very, very niche and it's not sensible to have it in the project. And so one thing you can do, or for me it was difficult to just say, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, close. That's difficult for me. Sometimes you have to do it. Maybe you can spend a little bit more than just 5 or 6 words. One thing you can do is, refer to the contributing guide, and like Tom mentioned yesterday in the keynote again, maybe it makes sense to say, well, before opening a pull request, make sure there's an associated issue or discussion, so that we get the time to make sure that the design, the API is sensible and it's in line with what we want, etc. And if someone just opens, someone bypass, everyone will bypass your contributing guide. When someone does it, instead of being personal, because you have this thing to back you up, you can say, here's this document that you kind of should have read, and it clearly says, please open an issue or discussion first. And so you have something to safeguard you, and the other person understands this is not personal. Hopefully the other person understands it. It's not personal, it's just the way it is. And if you're peculiar about the style, the testing, the naming, the conventions, the doc strings, whatever, make sure it's in the contributing guide. And so when you have to request those changes that will look picky, you can just say, here's the guide that you should have read, and it contains these instructions, so please do comply with them. And so I'm not trying to be obnoxious when I say docstring should have these specific formats. I mean, there's code all around you, just take the hint. If all of the docstrings are formatted the same, yours should be too, and people will miss it. So, contributing guide, and people understand, okay, it's not personal, it was there, I just missed it. And then, the cherry on top, closing PRs. For me this was difficult. Maybe some of you actually take a kick out of closing PRs, I hope not. But one thing I did was when I closed PRs, if they had, say, a user was trying to do something, it was not the direction we wanted to go in. Maybe they did something that was helpful, inside of in the middle of all of the changes they proposed, something was helpful, useful, maybe extract that piece, make a different PR, add them as a co-author, and merge that piece. It happened to us. It happened to me. I had to close a PR because it was a subjective change and we didn't agree with it, but some parts were objectively good, and so I did that. I took those parts, I opened the API with those changes. I added the original author as a co-author, so that even though I was the one that made the commit, if you go to the commit history, that person also shows up as a contributor to that commit. And I pushed those changes. And when I closed, I said, sorry, this is subjective, we don't agree. We took the good parts, they were merged in this PR, you're a co-author. And I think to some people this might be really important if you're a newcomer trying to contribute to a project for the first time. I think the co-author part is very important because then they are associated with it, and it's different for them to say in an interview, yeah, I'm a contributor to this project, or I opened the pull request, it was closed, but then they allegedly took my suggestions and implemented them somewhere else. So I think this part was actually key. And to me, it makes me feel good, you know, if I can add someone else as a co-author, it's good because then they clearly contributed. So that was one thing I did, and one hell of a challenge actually, so to manage these interactions. Now, I had a story, but there's no time, so you can ask about it later. I kind of actually already told the story in between. It was about the time I had to close this big PR. And then finally, working on a big code base, something that doesn't fit in your head, you know, it's too big, you don't know how everything works. When you start working in this code base, it already exists, so you're not creating it from scratch. So there's lots of moving parts and pieces, and how do you handle that? And because I don't know everything, I didn't know everything, and I don't know everything about that specific project, whenever I was working on a feature, doing software engineering, because I had to design APIs or whatever, there were four points that I always kept in mind. And those were, think of what's best for the developer. So the person that's going to use my package, my module, my whatever, what's best for them, not for me, for them. Another important thing, I'm a mathematician, so I have to think of what's the spirit of the issue and not what's the letter of the issue. Because if sometimes an issue will say something like this, if there's such an input, you need some output. And this was shown in today's keynote in the morning, right? There's some input, make sure you get this output. And I'm a mathematician, so the logical answer is just implement a function that returns the required output. It's doing what it's asked, like the letter of the issue. But that's not the point. I have to think of the spirit of the issue. What's not written there that I should be doing? So, and this was a challenge for me, I'll tell you that. Another thing that was a bit upsetting but makes sense is I need to take the hit. If I'm writing the code for this package, I take the hit so that the dev doesn't. If I have to do something boring, I'll do it so that the dev doesn't. If I have to do something repetitive, I'll do it so the dev doesn't. Do I need to do something hard? Tough luck, Rodrigo, you're being paid for it, so I do it so that you don't. So always keep that in mind. And finally, by these decisions, if I design the API in this way, am I preventing something reasonable from being possible? Like, is there something, maybe I can't think of a good use case yet, but if this sounds reasonable, am I preventing it from being done? So, keep that in mind. I feel like I should end.
Yeah, we're at time.
We're at time?
If anyone's got a question,
I'm very close. Take notes if it's a big project, writing them down. Talk to an audio recorder, take notes because it will help things cement. And then I had a very nice personal pull request checklist. We have to go through this, but it's very simple. So I read the issue, I write some code. Did I fix the whole issue? Well, if I didn't, I should probably read the issue again, write some code. Did I fix the whole issue? If I did, I run the tests. And then I run the tests again for good measure, just to make sure. Then, did I clean the prints that I added, because I invariably add prints, you know, to check stuff. Did I clean those? I didn't, so run the tests. But if I did, let's run the tests again, just for good measure. And then, was running the tests the last thing I did before pushing this? If not, run the tests. Or if I don't remember, which is usually the case. And if I did, I can make the PR. And if it sounds like I obsessively ran the tests, it's because I did. And that's because every time I didn't know if I had run the tests, CI broke. So I just ran the tests all the time. And that's essentially my PR checklist. You can take it. It's written elsewhere. You can just take a photo from those places. And finally, free open source software is a gift. You can't go to the supermarket and grab a chicken for free. You have to pay for it. But free open source is a gift, so we should take care of it and enjoy it. This was presented with this tool. People usually ask me about it. And I would very much appreciate it if you gave me some feedback on the talk. Just scan the QR code, say that the talk sucked, and then you get the link to the notes. So there's a written version of this talk you can check. Thank you for your time.